Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our session today covering the role of Indigenous knowledge in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. I come to this as somebody who's found the combination of Indigenous knowledge with larger knowledge systems, or as a part of larger knowledge systems, to be really fascinating and really essential as we grapple with a rapidly changing world. The agreement to prevent unregulated fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean, which is commonly referred to as the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, was signed in 2018 and entered into force in 2021. The agreement has 10 parties, including the United States, Russia, China, Canada, Japan, Norway, Iceland, South Korea, the Kingdom of Denmark, and the European Union. And this agreement is an example of the precautionary principle in action, looking at an emerging fishery, the prospects of an emerging fishery in a part of the world that has traditionally not been accessible because it's been covered in ice. But as the Arctic Ocean is warming, the sea ice is thinning and shrinking, the region's becoming more accessible. And so this agreement was in anticipation of the prospect of an unregulated fishery emerging to be able to get in front of that. And it has a really interesting, unique role for Indigenous knowledge. The Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement specifically recalls the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples or indigenous knowledge is referenced on 6 occasions in the agreement. It calls for the conduction of scientific research under a framework of the Joint Program of Scientific Research and Monitoring, and for a role of Indigenous knowledge in that. Specifically, Article 4, Bullet 4 of the agreement says that the parties shall ensure that the Joint Program of Scientific Research and Monitoring takes into account Indigenous knowledge and explicitly is in there. So we have 4 incredible speakers here today to give us a really well-rounded view on the significance of this agreement. So we'll hear first from Ambassador David Balton, with whom I worked closely at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Polar Institute. He formerly served as the U.S. Ambassador for Oceans and Fisheries, and in that capacity, he chaired the international negotiations that produced the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. So he's here with us today in his capacity as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Arctic Initiative. And then we have 3 wonderful speakers from Inuit Circumpolar Council. So we have Herb Nakimayak, president of ICC Canada. We have Vernay Agnabugak, Inuit Arctic Policy Director with Inuit Circumpolar Council Alaska, and Victoria Kutuk Bushman, who is with the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Greenland. So we have fantastic speakers. I think we should just dive right in. I'm going to hand the floor first over to Ambassador David Balton for his remarks. And Dave, if you want to give any further introduction to yourself, please go ahead and do so. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marisol. Thanks also to the Dickey Center for inviting me. No, I think you've given me plenty of introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with my colleagues from ICC, Herb, Vernay, and Victoria. What I will do in maybe 7, 8 minutes is give a little background about how the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement came to be and speak a little more specifically about the inclusion of those provisions you referenced, Marisol, in the agreement relating to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge. What I'm going to start by doing, if I can, is share my screen. And can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see that map? Okay. Well, for those of you who are listening in, watching, who may not have spent much time looking at a map of the world with the North Pole in the middle, here's one. It used to hang in my office at the Department of State. It's a little disorienting at first if you're not familiar with this bit of geography, but starting sort of if this were a clock at 12 o'clock and going around counterclockwise, first nation you see here is the United States, the north coast of Alaska. Next, moving around, Canada, a very large area in the Arctic, particularly this Arctic archipelago. Here we have Greenland, still part of the Kingdom of Denmark, still not for sale. Down here is Iceland. Over here we have three countries in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. But of particular importance for this discussion, only of those three does Norway have a coastline on the Arctic Ocean itself, plus these islands here of Svalbard. All the rest of the clock face, as it were, is the Russian Federation. The only other thing I would mention from this map or call attention to is the purple line one sees in the middle of this ocean space. That line everywhere is 200 nautical miles from the nearest point on land. And for those of you familiar with the basic international law of the sea, you'll know that within 200 miles of shore, a nation has exclusive jurisdiction with respect to managing fisheries. But in areas beyond 200 nautical miles, so-called high seas areas, including this large one in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, in principle, vessels from any nation have the right to fish there. Okay, that's a little bit of geography. When it comes to fisheries, the Arctic really is not a single region in a sense. On the Atlantic side of the Arctic, there are very active fisheries going on in the part of the North Atlantic that comes up here into the Barents Sea, part of the Arctic Ocean. And there are a number of international mechanisms in place for managing those fisheries. What you see on the map on the left is the area, the high seas areas, I should say, in which fisheries are managed through something called the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. And a part of that commission's mandate actually extends up into the high seas area of the Central Arctic Ocean. That's what you see on the map on the right. There's a slight overlap there. And one of the things we needed to consider as we're moving forward with this Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. On the other side of the Arctic, the side closest to the Bering Sea and the North Pacific Ocean, there really are no commercial fisheries of any consequence north of the Bering Strait. Russia is starting to experiment with some fisheries on its side of the Chukchi Sea, but it's still not much going on there of commercial value and no international mechanisms in place to manage active fisheries north of the Bering Strait. And in that high seas area of the Central Arctic Ocean, the piece you see here in the middle, outlined in red, which is not small, by the way, it's about the same size as the Mediterranean Sea. There has never been commercial fishery in recorded history, as Marisol was saying, because it has been covered by sea ice year-round. Until now. Here are a couple of depictions of the consequences of climate change in the Arctic, showing just how much the ice has diminished. You see a picture from, I think it's September probably of 1984 compared to 2012. You can see just how much the sea ice coverage has diminished. And in the upper right-hand corner, you see the trend lines. This is over the course of, oh, I don't know, almost 50 years, right? Starting in 1979, right up to this year in July. And the trend line is very decidedly downward. And in 2012, which is still the low point, in this slide, you can see just how much of the Central Arctic Ocean was not covered by ice. In particular, of particular concern are the areas that are here highlighted in orange. I should say thanks to our friends from Pew who developed this map. Those are the so-called Chukchi Cap and Borderlands Plateau area, relatively shallow waters of the Central Arctic Ocean where, in theory, fisheries might begin at some point. In the United States, roughly 15 years ago, a decision was taken to prohibit commercial fisheries in that part of the U.S. fishery zone, the U.S. EEZ, north of Alaska, shaded here on this map. Why? The United States felt that it didn't have enough scientific information with which to manage fisheries in that area properly. So we closed the area to commercial fisheries, and that is still in effect. And sometime soon thereafter, Canada followed suit and adopted a similar measure for waters under its jurisdiction to the east of this area in the Beaufort Sea. But of course, for Canada and the United States, and for the other 3 countries that rim this high seas area, jurisdiction ends at the 200-mile line. And the concern was that vessels from other countries might send their, rather other countries, governments of other countries might send their vessels to fish at mile 201, just beyond the regulatory reach of the coastal states. And so those 5 nations got together for several years, actually, had somewhat informal talks, but ultimately produced a non-binding statement, the Oslo Declaration in 2015, which had 2 propositions. First, these 5 nations would not authorize their own vessels to fish in this high seas area. And 2, that they would start a joint science program to better understand the ecology, environment of this region. But these countries also recognized that they could not solve this problem on their own. They needed to get other countries with large fishing fleets, possibly capable of fishing in that high seas area, to agree not to fish. And that is why there was launched a broader round of negotiations. There we are sitting around a table. It's an accurate depiction of the negotiating process. In addition to those initial 5, now sitting at the table, starting in roughly 2015, were China, Japan, South Korea, the European Union, and Iceland. And those 10 delegations met 6 times over the course of basically 2 years and produced the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. And as Marisol said, it was signed in 2018, entered into force in 2021. Its basic provisions: it prohibits commercial fishing in that high seas area, at least until 2037, and that moratorium will continue in additional 5-year increments beyond 2037 unless any one of the parties objects. There was a commitment to create a joint program of scientific research and monitoring. We'll hear more about that later. The parties would meet regularly at conferences of the parties every 2 years in principle. Also, there would be scientific meetings. All decisions would be made by consensus, at least decisions on matters of substance. And this is the main focus of our event today, the agreement included provisions on Indigenous knowledge and about Arctic Indigenous peoples that were, I would say, if not revolutionary, at least innovative. They were new for a binding agreement. That was a great achievement here. Marisol mentioned them in passing. Let's take a little closer look at them. In the preamble, the part of the agreement that comes before the so-called operative provisions, the preamble recalls the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It recognizes the interests of Arctic Indigenous peoples, among others, in the long-term conservation and sustainable use of the living resources of the CAO, Central Arctic Ocean, and it underlines the importance of involving these people and their communities in pursuing their interests. And it calls for the use of both scientific knowledge and Indigenous and local knowledge of the living marine resources of the Arctic Ocean. And then in the operative provisions, and again, Marisol previewed this, in creating the joint program of scientific research and monitoring, the agreement required the parties to ensure that the program take into account Indigenous and local knowledge. And in the provisions relating to review and implementation of the agreement, it required the parties to review on a regular basis all information developed through the joint program from all sources, including from Indigenous and local knowledge. And perhaps most important of all, the agreement guaranteed the right of Arctic Indigenous peoples to participate in the implementation of the agreement. How did these provisions wind up here? Well, I think it is largely because there were Arctic Indigenous peoples at the table during the negotiation. 3 of the delegations, those from the Kingdom of Denmark / Greenland, Canada, and the United States, included representatives of Arctic indigenous communities from their countries to be on the delegations. And those people were quite active, typically speaking up, not so much as members of their delegation, but on um, advocating on behalf of their communities. And they were the ones who persuaded everyone successfully to include the provisions we've just gone through here. We may hear more about that from Herb when it's his chance to speak. For me, that was one of the great accomplishments of the agreement, and I am proud to have been a part of it and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Marisol, thanks very much, and I'll be around to be part of the question and answer period. Now I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. I think that's really helpful background and initial framing to understand, the larger kind of how the agreement came to be, what are the different dimensions of it. And something that you said that stands out is that, in terms of how did Indigenous peoples become a part of this agreement, they were at the table, right? And so that's where, bodies like the Arctic Council, where Indigenous peoples as permanent participants have full consultative rights, is so important. And honestly, I've been so impressed at how ICC has really pushed the bounds of what's possible with the inclusion of Indigenous peoples at organizations like the International Maritime Organization and other places where we really need to be kind of filling out the types of knowledge systems that we are referencing as we deal with an era of immense disruption and trying to navigate that and get in front of some of that risk. So thank you again, Dave. So now I would love to hand the floor over to Vernay for her to provide an introduction to Indigenous knowledge and to provide some more background. And Vernay, if you would like to provide any other introduction for yourself, please do so. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Marisol. And thanks, Ambassador Bolton, for the good overview. So, o nga uganisi ato nasipay na ang navagak, kingit miuguro nga. So ito nga Inuit Circumpolar Council Alaska me. My name is Vernay ang Navagak. I am from the village of Kingigin, which is in the Bering Strait region. It's the northwestern part of Alaska, right on the coast, where the Bering Sea turns to the Chukchi Sea. And I'm the Inuit Arctic Policy Director here at ICC Alaska. And we and our team, I'm sure they can add a little bit about themselves as we go along here, are here to share our experience about the role of Indigenous knowledge in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Before we begin, I want to share a little bit about who we are. The Inuit Circumpolar Council is an international Indigenous peoples organization founded in 1977 by the late Eben Hobson Sr. from Utqiagvik or Barrow, Alaska, to strengthen unity among Inuit of Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka, to promote Inuit rights and interests at the international level, develop and encourage long-term policies that safeguard the Arctic environment, and to seek full and effective participation and meaningful engagement in the political, economic, and social development of the Arctic region. Next slide. Today, ICC holds consultative 2 status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, is one of 6 permanent participants at the Arctic Council, and is the first Indigenous peoples organization to gain consultative status at the International Maritime Organization, gained in November of 2021. And in July of this year, ICC was officially granted permanent consultative status at the IMO, and you may hear a little bit more. ICC also participates directly in this Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement through our national delegations in Alaska as part of the United States, in Canada, and in Greenland as part of Denmark, Faroe Islands, and Greenland delegation. Next slide. ICC was founded at a time where our people were facing numerous attacks on our food security and food sovereignty from external forces. While we don't have the time to more thoroughly go through this, I will briefly touch upon them. In 1977, the International Whaling Commission extended a ban on Alaskan Inuit traditional bowhead whale hunting without consultation. Then in 1918, the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty became heavily enforced in Alaska in 1961, which made hunting migratory waterfowl illegal in the springtime without taking into consideration Inuit traditional hunting of geese and ducks for our survival and without consultation. Now in 2020, present day, the Yukon River, Kuskokwim River, and Norton Sound salmon crash is causing a high rate of food insecurity, loss of culture and tradition, and hurt for our region. This is why we continue to advocate to ensure that our rights to hunt, fish, and live our culture and way of life are upheld and respected. ICC brings our voice to international forums to ensure that Inuit and Indigenous knowledge are meaningfully included in all decisions that affect our people, our homelands, and our way of life, now and into the future. Okay. We have had a strong foundation laid for us by our former leadership from the beginning. ICC's work has been rooted in advancing Indigenous knowledge, our knowledge that sustains our food security, food sovereignty, hunting culture, and way of life. This commitment was carried forward in some of ICC's earliest policy frameworks, including our former ICC declarations, which mandates the work that we do, and including this Inuit Arctic policy, which was published in 2010, that outlined 8 priority areas for action on Inuit rights, peace, and security issues, including the following on the screen. While we don't have a lot of time to go into that, I do want to point to one of the articles in the Inuit Arctic policy document from 2010. Article 21 called for Arctic state governments to dedicate increased resources to Arctic marine-related research, where research priorities should be determined together with Inuit, with Indigenous knowledge and science. In this document, it said that the Arctic 5 coastal states, Russia, United States, Canada, Norway, and Denmark, in respect to the Faroe Islands and Greenland, cooperate closely in the Arctic Ocean with each other and other interested parties. Again, this is back from 2010. The cooperation includes a collection of scientific research and data concerning the continental shelf, the protection of the marine environment, and other research. It called for this cooperation to be based on mutual trust and transparency, and to be strengthened through timely exchanges of data and analysis. Next slide. ICC has accumulated an immense body of work produced to advance Inuit food security, food sovereignty, and Indigenous knowledge. We do not, again, have enough time to hear about all this work here. However, this work has built upon itself. Since ICC's inception, our work has focused on advancing Inuit food security, food sovereignty, protecting our hunting and culture and way of life, while recognizing that our Indigenous knowledge is the foundation of who we are, our culture, and our entire existence. Here you can see some of the work that we have completed, all tied to our hunting and fishing culture, our language, our knowledge, and our entire way of life. And these go through the years. You can see from 1983, we had the Alaska Native Review Commission work, which was published in the book Village Journey, that had to do with doing a series of interviews across Alaska at the time when land claims was done, and looking at the whether or not there were ways we could strengthen our hunting and fishing rights that we felt didn't quite make the land claims agreement. And there have been several acts of Congress to try to remedy that. And then we went from 2011 to 2015 through the ICC Alaska Food Security Project, the Alaskan Inuit Food Security Conceptual Framework, and the definition of Indigenous knowledge was done at that time. ICC authored a paper on the application of Indigenous knowledge in the Arctic Council. And then moving forward, we had an ICC Wildlife Management Summit in 2017, and work that has continued since then. We had a food sovereignty and self-governance, Inuit role in managing the Arctic resources, legal analysis and recommendations that came out of that, the Alaskan Inuit Food Sovereignty Management Action Plan. We had a co-production of knowledge paper published. And then most recently, we just released the Inuit Circumpolar Council's Indigenous Knowledge Focus Group report on advancing Indigenous knowledge from theory to practice. And that one, we brought Inuit together from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, staff and knowledge holders to look at advancing Indigenous knowledge from theory to practice, utilizing both the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement work that we're involved in and some Arctic Council work on coastal biodiversity monitoring plan. Next slide. During this food security project that I was mentioning, an elder explained that the Arctic can be seen as a puzzle made up of many pieces, and each of those pieces has a piece that is needed to make up our ecosystem, to understand the Arctic and to understand our food security. Next slide. A problem happens when people from outside our culture come in and just look at one of those pieces to study it and make policy recommendations or decisions about what is happening in the Arctic without considering the whole. Our people understand that these pieces are always adjusting, and we pay close attention to where those pieces connect. And in order to understand our food security and the Arctic, we need to look at all these pieces holistically. And this requires the meaningful engagement of Inuit and our Indigenous knowledge on all matters and decision-making that affect our hunticulture, our people, and our way of life. Next slide. So this is going back to ICC's work. And I wanted to mention that within all of this work and leading up to the protocols that were developed, the Circumpolar Inuit Protocols for Ethical and Equitable Engagement, Inuit leadership recognized that while there is a growing awareness of the importance of Indigenous knowledge and the involvement of Indigenous peoples, there are still many international forums that utilize top-down approaches that are rooted in processes that raise barriers to the meaningful engagement of Inuit and the utilization of Indigenous knowledge. Next slide. ICC's definition on Indigenous knowledge, so I'll leave it up here on the screen and read it. We have defined Indigenous knowledge as a systematic way of thinking applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It includes insights based on evidence and acquired through direct and long-term experiences, an extensive multi-generational observation, lessons, and skills. It has developed over millennia and is still developing in a living process, including knowledge acquired today and in the future, and it is passed down from generation to generation. This definition was created to bring understanding to scientists of what our knowledge is and policymakers. A lot of advocacy was done during this time to bring this awareness of this terminology out and for Indigenous knowledge to be actually informing the decision making. Next slide. And I'm just going to read from the slide here, and I'm sharing this. This came from a presentation that we made in March at the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement Scientific Coordinating Group meeting. We had a very good, well-received presentation that we delivered on Indigenous knowledge working together with science. I wish we had more time to go through that today, but we can share this, at least what we prepared for that in working together with our Indigenous knowledge holders and in the relationships and the communications that we've had with the scientific community. So you see from Indigenous knowledge, it's holistic. These are looking at the strengths and differences. Scientific knowledge is linear and works in isolation. Indigenous knowledge takes in multiple variables and focuses on the relationships between them. Science works by drawing out variables and dissecting them into many parts to generate understanding. Indigenous knowledge represents our collective knowledge passed down over many generations, and science relies on individual experts informed by academic qualifications. Our knowledge embedded with our cultural values and spirituality and relationships between all of life, land, water, and air that sustains our people and way of life is different from the objective way of removing personal biases and other standards across the scientific research process and community. Our knowledge is naturally in line with our environment and is highly adaptable. Science is very rigorous. It takes the time needed to complete and publish results, peer-reviewed results. And Indigenous knowledge is not for profit. It's not recognized, not often recognized in scientific research, or has a history of not being often recognized in scientific research at the same level of science. And science, the scientific field remains a dominant system where dedicated funding exists. And that takes care of my slides for now, and we're going to transition to Herb.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Renee. That was really fantastic. And just to kind of highlight a couple of things that I think are really important that you demonstrated repeatedly is really this way of understanding the systems at play. And I think that's really one of the challenges that policy is grappling with now as we have, you know, if you use the planetary boundaries framework, for instance, which is something that I've started referring to convey that this is not just about climate change. This is about, you know, these the systems, the Earth systems that make, you know, Earth, the planet, the very special planet that it is, are being systematically undermined. And so we have to think outside the box to challenge some of the assumptions and the ways that you know, science has worked, that policy, you know, even the way that governments think about issues within silos, to really understand them, you know, the systems at play. And so I think some of these concepts, like the food security fan, that image, and I would refer people to the Inuit Circumpolar Council website for access to the equitable and ethical engagement protocols document, which is really very important, as well as access to the other documents that Vernay showed. But really showing, again, this web of connectivity. And I love that, the idea of it being a puzzle, and you take one piece out. You can't just say, oh, well, this is the puzzle. You have to understand the connections and the relationships. So thank you for highlighting that. And so now I'd like to pass the floor over to Herb. And Herb, if you would like to provide any further introduction to yourself, other than as I introduced you as the president of ICC Canada, please go ahead and do so. And I know your camera's not working, but we can hear you. So we'll just show the slides, and I'll hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisol. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to express my thanks to my previous speakers, and also to all of you who are helping with logistics, because I cannot seem to move anything here. My name is Herb Nakamayak. I'm the interim president for ICC Canada and vice chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. The role that Indigenous knowledge in Keofa, you know, what we've accomplished under Keofa, you know, how Inuit have engaged in Keofa has been really one of the successes of this agreement, demonstrating negotiations between Indigenous peoples, consultation with Inuit, and possibly an opportunity to set a good example for other agreements around the world. As you know, ICC has been involved in the CAO fisheries discussion since the start of the previous decade. We build on the work leadership from across the regions and offices who have ensured that our knowledge and lived experiences is critical to the future management of the Central Ocean's resources. For these initial stages, ICC Alaska and ICC Canada have communicated with and lobbied with their respective governments and delegations to ensure the inclusion of our knowledge and respecting our longstanding presence in the Arctic. Both governments were ultimately receptive to including Inuit and their delegations, with the Danish government following suit with ICC Greenland later. We engage in Keofa in meetings in and out of other fora like this webinar today. Our ICC team, made up of representatives from ICC Alaska, ICC Canada, and ICC Greenland, highlight and remind that we engage as members of our respective national delegations, not as ICC specifically. As always, we are thankful for the working relationships we have built together with our national delegations, recognize the involved and collaborative work that we all undertook to get to that point. Next slide, please. including the rules and procedures, a written section of the Joint Program of Scientific Research and Monitoring on Indigenous Knowledge and co-production of knowledge, and contributing to shaping conservation and management measures for exploratory fishing. As a result of having lobbied for inclusion of involvement in the CAOFA, Inuit have been involved in building the foundation of framework documents for the agreement from the ground up. Indeed, every major framework publication and report has had our input and positions included since COP1. The established representation on our national delegations is provided for within the rules and procedures document established at CAOFA's COP1. Again, sorry, I said to reiterate that. Key to our work, both in our national delegations with CAOFA, is co-development. Scientists, academics, and agreements processes like CAOFA need to engage with Inuit early on and often in our order for leaders, knowledge holders, and other community to make decisions on how we engage in work. The work called for under the JPSRM seeks to set out the stage to conduct this necessary work, and it is on us to ensure that meaningful engagement is part of implementing the JPSRM. We have a series of tasks and priorities as called under the scientific coordinating group's work, and ensuring Indigenous knowledge informs this work from the convening of our knowledge holders to data governance and sovereignty considerations is underway. Next slide, please. I will pass this on to Victoria, I believe. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Herb. So yeah, I'll pass the floor over to Victoria, who is joining us and her position at Inuit Circumpolar Council Greenland as the Marine Management Advisor. And she'll take us more through the work that's been done through the Joint Program for Scientific Research and Monitoring.
Actually, this wasn't what I was intending on speaking on. I do have my own slides. I can move on to this portion if we like. But given the background that we have gotten on CAOFA, I did want to highlight that there's a number of additional conventions, treaties, negotiations that Inuit are engaged on that include Indigenous knowledge, or to the extent possible, we are negotiating that they include Indigenous knowledge. So I can walk us through a couple of additional things. I'm going to highlight in this particular presentation the role of Indigenous knowledge, particular to a bilateral negotiation for a new protected area in a region called Pikialasosoq. This is in the region between northern Canada and northern Greenland, and it's been an area of ICC's work for over a decade. So in 2013, we had our first Pikialasosoq workshop. So communities expressed an interest on the Greenland and Canada sides to create a new protected area that would be led by Inuit and would include the use of Indigenous knowledge as a foundational concept for how the area was managed. In 2017, we had a commission that concluded with 3 recommendations, and this included the management. It included that we wanted a management authority that was led by Inuit. We wanted there to be a protected area designated that would include the polynya. So the Pikialasosoq means the great upwelling. This is a major polynya in the Arctic. And we also wanted to request a travel-free zone for Inuit. So opening up the borders to these traditional and historical hunting and fishing grounds, because Inuit have been passing through this imaginary border for thousands of years. Well, about 1,000 years. In 2023, we did get a letter of intent from the government of Greenland and the government of Canada saying that they intend to create this bilateral protected area, but negotiations are ongoing. And in September 2024, ICC helped to convene the first meeting of the parties, which was a historic move for us to be able to discuss what does it mean to have an Inuit-led protected area? What does it mean to establish an Inuit-led management authority? And what do we want to do with Indigenous knowledge within the procedures that are developed around the protected area? Next slide, please. So I'm giving you an advanced view actually of a new report that we have out of the ICC Greenland office specifically. This is our Oceans and Inuit Knowledge Project. It's been several years of us working with hunters and fishers and other craftspeoples and knowledge holders in the north part of Greenland. And we have quite a bit to share that they have put forward as their visions and priorities and needs for the development of the Pikialasorsoaq area. Next slide, please. To give us a little orientation of what we're looking at, this is the top part of Canada over here and the top part of Greenland on the other side. And the Pikialasorsoaq area is here highlighted in a shaded color. This might seem like a small area, but it's actually approximately the size of Iceland. So it is a rather large conservation area in adjacency to the Central Arctic Ocean, and also quite a number of other protected area designations that are up and coming. And this is one of the ones that has been most advanced in recent years. We worked in a number of communities, including Hiorapaluk, Qaanaaq, Haviravik, Kultossuaq, and Upernavik. Sorry, you have to look so closely. It's because it's from the official publication, so put your glasses on and lean close if you're interested. Next slide, please. And this is to share that in these, they're not consultations, but in these knowledge workshops, we did have a number of sort of topics that Inuit felt were very important to showcase that their knowledge is useful for. And the 5 that came out of this in particular were the use of Indigenous knowledge for marine ecology, the use of Indigenous knowledge for wildlife management, the use of Indigenous knowledge as it comes to traditional economies, the use of Indigenous knowledge in research governance, and the use of Indigenous knowledge in marine governance. And these areas were all explored over several years in communication and dialogue and in work with our communities in this area. Next slide, please. There are a number of key messages that are coming from here. You are not meant to read all of this. I'm highlighting 2 on this particular page. Of the 13 key messages, one includes that Indigenous knowledge is extremely important for observing climate change impacts. And this has been a really important part of, discussions around protected area development designation and development and management for Inuit is the role that our knowledge has, particularly in looking at climate change and addressing a number of societal and cultural considerations around climate change in that regard. The second is that from our discussions with our knowledge holders, it's very clear that there's very concrete evidence of changes in biodiversity and changes in patterns and cycles of observed behavior, in particular in relation to critical species. And that's not to say species of conservation interest necessarily, but species that are important to us as Inuit. And this is a very important distinction for us because the management of the area should focus on what is important, of course, as well to Inuit. Next slide, please. Another point that came out of this is the need for Inuit to sort of help shape research governance. The short fallings, I suppose, of research in the Arctic have been of concern to Inuit, and we are certain that with the use of our knowledge and with engagement with our communities, we can help make the research processes stronger, and this should be an active part of the management authority. Next slide, please. And then here I would just want to make links. There are a number of other, of course, files and treaties and conventions and ongoing negotiations that are also related to marine governance. This includes the BBNJ, the High Seas Treaty, which comes into force in January. This currently does not have any particular legal standing for Indigenous knowledge, but this is something that is on an ongoing conversation and is something that globally Indigenous peoples are looking forward to under the BBNJ. The next is the OSPAR region. This is the Oslo-Paris Convention, which is the marine management treaty that governs what Ambassador Bolton had shown in one of his very nice maps, the region that is sort of between Greenland and Europe and south of the Central Arctic Ocean. This one, ICC has been offered to sit as a member, an observer under the Oslo-Paris Agreement, but we are in the process of figuring out to what extent we want to do that. But there is an effort on their side to include Indigenous knowledge, especially in the creation and designation of new marine protected areas in Inuit homelands, of which several have been sort of floated before. And another is the CBD. And while this is not typically considered a marine convention, it does have some synergies with protected area development, also with marine protected areas. And of particular interest is the goals under 30 by 30, which will compel states to create more marine protected areas and terrestrial protected areas. And then the subsidiary body on 8J and other provisions, which is a new subsidiary body that deals with Indigenous peoples' engagement and the use of Indigenous knowledge under the convention. And lastly is the IMO, and I could, if Herb was interested in speaking on this just for a very short, brief moment, he is our head of delegation on the IMO. But Herb, you just let me know if you'd like to speak on this particular item.
Thank you, Victoria. I can maybe just a couple of points. As you see here, ICC, in support of our work, in protected area management, ICC has been working with the IMO, having gained provisional status, as you mentioned, provisional consultative status since 2021, and since this July, permanent consultative status. So good work, ICC and team. While the status is still subject to final approval in December, our work continues on future engagement with the IMO. It is evident that the increase in large vessel traffic transiting our waters raises concerns for hunters' safety. The interference that ship traffic has increased adverse impacts on the Arctic ecosystems on our homeland, including underwater radiant noise, ship strikes, and entanglements of marine mammals, gray water discharge, disturbances of black carbon causing sea ice to melt quickly. One last point here at the IMO, ICC can and does engage on work to address these impacts. Through our consultative status, we're able to contribute to amending the Polar Code, reducing shipping pollution, and near the Arctic, advocating for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the development of policies, guidelines, and regulations administered by the IMO. Thank you, Victoria. I'll give it back to you.
Yes, thank you, Herb. This is actually all that I have for this section, so I would turn it over to our organizers for the Q&A portion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. And Vernay, please, did you want to add something? While she's getting that set up, I'll just add one other thing, Vernay, that you mentioned is just how adaptable Indigenous knowledge is. And I think that's also something that is a real strength, because it is true that it's really challenging with really robust peer-reviewed reports like the IPCC or even the Arctic Report Card, which would come out annually. The amount of time that goes into that to be able to go through the peer review process to then have something that you can point to with medium or high confidence or whatever confidence interval there is, it's time intensive, and especially as we are because we're dealing with an era where we have systems that are dynamic and interacting, and we're going to be seeing new phenomena that we've never seen before. We need that agility and that adaptability. And so I think that's something that's a really a real strength of Indigenous knowledge that I'm really curious about how that could be could serve as a further model. And I definitely want to get into that more in the Q&A as well.
Okay, so Herb, do you want to speak to this? This is slide 14.
Yep. All right. Thank you. It is important to highlight just how critically important being involved in CAOFA and the future of the CAO is for Inuit. We are a marine people. We have lived in our Arctic homeland for thousands of years and are intimately aware of the character and the interactions of our land, seas, and ice. Further, we are also the first impacted by changes, excuse me, to the environment and activities within the Central Ocean. We're ready to work with any party who engages with us sustainably, with us to sustainably manage the Central Ocean. In that sense, the connection to the CAO with our regional waters is evident. This is particular of importance given that the JPS RM focuses on 3 ecological zones. 1, the waters within the agreement area boundaries. 2, the continental shelf slope areas peripheral to the agreement area. And 3, the Pacific and Atlantic marine gateways. Work on both gateways is critical due to the intermix of currents, ships entering the CAO and other areas. These are also regional seas and ecosystems that link with the CAO and that Inuit call home. Having input and engagement in this process from all our regions is critical. In my own region, the ISR, the Inuit Settlement Region in Canada's Western Arctic, the boundaries of our waters actually overlap with the Central Ocean, and our management and monitoring programs highlight and track the behaviors of species who call both the CO and our waters home. I'd like to provide a brief example. Next slide, please. Beluga monitoring. As chair of the Fisheries Joint Management Committee, one of the FGMC's flagship initiatives is the Beluga Monitoring Program, which has been in place since 1973. It is one of the longest running and most comprehensive data sets in the world on a beluga population, and responsibility for this program was taken on by FGMC in 1987 once the Inuit Final Agreement was signed. This program feeds into the management of beluga populations jointly between the Inuit, Canada, and Nunavut in Alaska, and ensures that beluga management aligns with traditional practices. Inuit hunters, fishers, and community members contribute invaluable observations about species behavior, seasonal patterns, and environmental changes. These insights are integrated into the scientific frameworks, creating a holistic understanding of Arctic ecosystems. These programs exemplify co-management in action, fostering trust and shared responsibility between Indigenous communities and scientific institutions. In summary, it is one model that of many representing the integrated of Indigenous knowledge with science to best inform sustainable resources management and empower community-driven governance. Well, Marisol, that is all I have for that. Thank you. And back to you.
Great, thank you so much. And then Vernay, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah,
to
so
that
you
as well?
can skip to slide 17. Going back to what Ambassador Bolton said about this agreement being the first of its kind, a legally binding agreement where Arctic Indigenous peoples, Inuit, and our knowledge are to be engaged in its implementation through our national delegations, we talked a little bit about the scientific coordinating group and wanted to also make a mention that this agreement's policy and decision-making body is a conference of the parties, and it's made up of all 10 signatories of the agreement. And that COP is supported by this scientific coordinating group, which is bringing together Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and scientific knowledge together to support this joint program. And to also look at how do we do this in real action? How do we move Indigenous knowledge from theory to practice to look at what processes and mechanisms bring together Indigenous knowledge and science in this framework, and in also moving it from that to the development of conservation and management measures for exploratory fishing, and for all of the objectives that this agreement has set to be met. Our input has directly, as Herb was saying, informed numerous foundational documents of this agreement. Because we have prioritized this work, we have been consistently engaged, as Herb mentioned, in all of the Conference of the Party meetings, in all of the scientific coordinating group meetings. And for us, it's really important that Indigenous knowledge has a role in informing ecological baselines for this agreement area that has not experienced a high level of activity, and in this proactive approach to sustaining this region to be able to remain a healthy marine ecosystem in the future. So we look at historical and recent changes in the abundance of animals, the species distribution, the movements, behaviors, habitat associations, the sea ice, the ocean currents, the weather patterns, environmental conditions observed by our own communities, the movement, the distribution, and the diet of the marine mammals, fish, and birds, in which our people monitor. When we eat the animals, we often open up their stomachs. We're seeing if the animals are healthy. We are seeing what they are eating. We know what the food chain is of these animals, including our people within that food chain, and the species and habitat relationships. So we put forward under this joint program of scientific research and monitoring that some contributions that Indigenous knowledge has to offer includes direct year-round observations and living experience of being in the Arctic year-round. Sometimes there are research efforts that go on for part of the season, but not the entire year. And our people have consistently lived in this region for thousands of years. We look at the connections and relationships that we have with these animals and with this environment, which comes from a different point of view and a different relationality than somebody who might be coming in to study the area or has not lived with these resources and with the Arctic and the sea ice and everything that sustains our culture and way of life. So we know that this agreement must follow this precautionary approach. We know that this agreement area is unique and this entire approach is unique, that it needs to be looked at differently, and that we shouldn't repeat what has happened in other areas of the high seas while we have the opportunity to do so. And we hope that in the future, like you mentioned, Marisol, that this approach and this agreement could be looked at as setting a new standard for the way international agreements are done and for the knowledge base that's coming together to inform the implementation and the management of such agreements. And we know that this Central Arctic Ocean ecosystem is sensitive due to the cold climate and how long it takes for many organisms and animals to grow, reproduce, and recover. And with any activities that are happening in the marine environment, Inuit are the first to feel those impacts as we live closest to this agreement area. We have not only is our knowledge is not this abstract thing right here. So there are ways that our knowledge is used together with research, but there are also ways that our knowledge is used on the land as we are out there hunting, fishing, and gathering and living our way of life that is used for our own survival. And so the recognition of the immense depth of knowledge that we do have, as well as how our Inuit languages are interconnected in that knowledge system, is very important. For example, the Ilok is the seal's maternal den near the pressure ridges where newborn seals reside until they're old enough to leave. And Nanum Iloa, the polar bear's maternal den on the shore-fast ice, being critical breeding and birthing habitats formed in ice structures, and these habitats depend on stable pressure ridges, multi-year ice, and shore-fast ice features. And within this process, we do want to bring some attention to what constitutes areas that need to be protected or need another layer of caution to be put in place before the area is disrupted. For example, if you look at the standard for how vulnerable marine ecosystems are assessed, often they're done through in the bottom ocean habitat, not so much in the surface of the ocean or the sea ice. And for us, it's important because this agreement area is in the high seas of the Arctic that we bring that understanding that these areas of our sea ice, particular to the seasonality and the time of the year, are also important characteristics that need to be looked at when we're starting to look at what areas may be vulnerable, or how do we move forward proactively to ensure that this ecosystem remains healthy and sustainable for the future. And that's all I have to add at the end here.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. So actually, one of the things you said, Vernay, about how, and this is something that Dave has mentioned multiple times in the past, about how the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, the recognition of UNDRIP and Indigenous peoples in this agreement really serves as a model for the inclusion in international law, and it's really interesting to think about how that may be replicated elsewhere. So I want to kind of open the floor. If Renee, if you had anything you wanted to add on that, and then I would love to pass it over to Ambassador Bolton to hear his thoughts on advancing that as well. We can just go over to you, Dave. If you want.
Okay, I can start. I'm sure Vernay and others have thoughts about this as well. I'm eager to hear them. A number of us were recently at the Arctic Circle Assembly, and the UN Secretary General's ocean envoy, a gentleman by the name of Peter Thompson, spoke about this issue on the plenary stage. And his pitch was that this fisheries agreement was the right approach, but of course it only pertains to fisheries, and I would say issues connected to fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. There are other industrial activities that are being contemplated for the same area of the planet, particularly shipping, but also potential seabed mining, perhaps other things as well. And the approach taken in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement is the right approach for dealing with these other potential human activities as well, namely precaution. Let's not willy-nilly permit these activities to go forward until we have a better sense of the environmental consequences of those activities. And also that some kind of regulatory framework with inclusion of Indigenous peoples and the use of Indigenous knowledge from the start is a critical element towards success if we are to get a handle on these things as well. So in all those ways, I think the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, I agree with Ambassador Thompson, can serve as a kind of inspiration or even model for where the international community might be going or ought to be going as it considers other pressures on the Central Arctic Ocean. Now, there is one other thing about the fisheries agreement that is worth noting, and that is, as Renee and Herb were mentioning, there are conferences of the parties taking place. We've had 4 of them. A 5th one is now being planned, I think in Brussels. All of them, and the science meetings as well, have involved all the parties, including Russia. And this is in person. At least the conferences of the parties are all in person. And this is in somewhat sharp contrast to, for example, the way the Arctic Council working groups are operating only virtually. We have found a way to have meetings in person, including Russian experts and officials in this agreement. And I think that is part of why the implementation of this agreement is moving forward reasonably well, as we've been hearing from the other speakers. Thanks, Marisol.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. And Vernay or anybody else want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I can if anyone else doesn't want to take the question.
I can speak a bit about the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in this agreement, from the beginning. I just wanted to share, as noted in our presentations earlier, Inuit have been engaged in KEOFA since the initial negotiations that led to the agreement. And I just want to say that, we're appreciative and we stand on the shoulders of leaders like Jimmy Stotts, the late Alfred Jacobson, Dwayne Smith, and many more who have advocated on behalf of Inuit to see our knowledge as people who live adjacent to and utilizing the waters of the CAO. Expect that when agreements are struck, negotiations are had, and discussions on governance commence. If they're about our region and where our people live, Inuit need to be at the table, ensuring free, prior informed consent, so that we're engaged by parties early. Early needs to continue to be the process followed in KEOFA and agreements in the future. As I mentioned earlier, this has an opportunity to demonstrate to the rest of the world what true consultation and engagement and inclusion of Indigenous peoples and our knowledge systems could really help amplify regulations, especially when it comes to developing important databases and data sets that are needed for this agreement area. Thank you, Marisol, and I'll pass it over to Renee or Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb. Yeah, completely agree. And we always make sure that we credit our former leadership, because we wouldn't be here today standing this up and doing this important work if that pathway to do that wasn't led by them and made possible by them. So going back to your question, Marisol, about the setting a new standard for Indigenous knowledge and the prospects for this more broadly under international law. Now that we have set this precedent and many examples of how Inuit have been engaged in agreements through legally binding contexts, or even through legally binding contexts, it's hard to justify having an agreement about our region, like Herb was saying, if it didn't involve our people, our knowledge, and our culture. And I think at the end of the day, we learned, and I'm saying we learned because we've been trying to communicate outward of how we are in a better situation if we have all knowledge systems working together than we are if we just if our future depended on one knowledge system, one way of looking at how you understand an ecosystem, or even the interconnecting pieces within that ecosystem. So there are benefits that Indigenous knowledge is contributing, which is not taking away from the science, but it's adding to a stronger product at the end. And we are also, I just came back from a polar law symposium, so I was just in Nuuk, and this topic came up while we were there. I was speaking on a topic while we were there on the Central Arctic Ocean, and there were many other topics being discussed. And I went to a session that was about the BBNJ agreement, the Central Arctic Ocean, the Antarctic Treaty. And so both in the presentation and in the discussions, people are wondering, and outside of that, for there and elsewhere, including at the last COP that we went to, people are wondering, how does this agreement intersect with other international agreements? And is the BBNJ agreement going to be looking towards the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement for what have they accomplished? How have they done that? And have lessons learned, or not reinventing the wheel if there's this agreement, for example, making a new pathway to how you do that in an internationally legally binding context. Yeah, I guess that's what I'll end there for that question.
Yeah,
And then,
well, that
Gloria,
that
if
actually,
you have anything else to add, please add.
yeah, because I think that is a really interesting question. As the BB&J agreement, the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, the High Seas Treaty, this covers, right, the high seas portion of the Central Arctic Ocean. And so actually, Dave, did you want to speak to that? Because I know you've actually published something on kind of thinking about this.
I have. I wrote that well before the BB&J agreement, the ICC treaty, was even finished, and some of its provisions shifted a little bit at the end. But anyway, my basic thought is that yes, the the conferences of the parties to the BB&J agreement are supposed to take into account regional regimes, and the CAO Fisheries Agreement sort of qualifies, at least in my mind, as a kind of regional regime, at least in respect of fisheries. Now, the BB&J agreement is, in principle, a mechanism for creating area-based management tools, including MPAs, in high seas areas. And there are some interesting questions about the overlap between the reach of that agreement and the CAO Fisheries Agreement. And there are at least theoretical questions about whether the BB&J COP might adopt at least some of the approaches of the CAO Fisheries Agreement, namely to include Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge in considering whether any additional area-based management tools for this high sea area ought to be adopted under the BB&J agreement.
Thanks so much, Dave. Victoria, did you want to add something? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I did have a few things to add. ICC has been following the BB&J, but not engaged actively in that work yet. But now that it is being ratified, things may change. But we do know that as it stands, it currently doesn't have any obligations to Indigenous knowledge. So I do hope that they will look towards the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement in how that could be structured and how those obligations could be written down into the procedures by which we engage. I know that this is also a bit difficult because unlike when we function in the Arctic, where Indigenous peoples, we tend to have quite good relationships. You know, Inuit and Sami have quite good relationships with our governments. This is not necessarily the case at a global level. So this is also something that I think as a region, as our states and as Indigenous peoples from this region can really put forward as a strength that we have to bring to the table as this moves forward.
So the last topic I do want to touch on relates to the protection of data sovereignty and protection of Indigenous knowledge as it relates to this agreement and beyond, especially as there is a growing recognition of the value that Indigenous knowledge adds. And you know, this agreement explicitly includes a data sharing protocol. So I would love, I know Herb, I think you had said you would be open to discussing this, and if anybody else wants to add anything, but just to that topic of how do we protect that knowledge and the topic of advancing data sovereignty while also including it more broadly.
Yeah, thank you, Marisol. I just have to say, you know, what a conversation. I was listening to everybody speak, the knowledge that all the speakers have of this agreement and their amazing work. I just wanted to share that. The role of data, you know, in CAOFA, along with the sharing and use of our Indigenous knowledge, is central to our upcoming, you know, on this agreement. Firstly, ICC, on behalf of Inuit, advocates that knowledge holders who provide their knowledge must retain access, ownership, and control of their knowledge and data. In practice, this is good. This is knowledge holds determining how and where their data is shared and with who, and for what purpose. You know, a lot of times in the past, I'm sure there have been a misinterpretation of some data, and we ensure that this data that's compiled and analyzed is used to ensure that, you know, it's helping us make decisions based on our way of life. This advocacy and process is laid out both within ICC's ethical and equitable engagement protocols as reference in CAOFA's data management sharing protocols. The work remains to lay this out within the standard operating procedures around data, along with ensuring alignment across our 4 countries and access and control to our data. To note, data procedures are heightened. Highlighted regional in Canada, in our 4 regional treaty organizations all have different but related data policies. that need to be respected when conducting work and within our lands and waters. While they're still at differing stages of completion, much of the work remains ongoing on strategies towards national data policies and how they interlink across our larger shared region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Did anybody else want to add anything on that topic?
Yeah,
Dave?
this is an important question, and I'm glad that it's come up. I think Renee was saying that in the context, I forget who was saying, it was Renee was saying in the context of the BB&J agreement, you're suddenly dealing with a lot of other governments whose relationships with Indigenous communities in their countries may not be so good. Well, even within the CAO Fisheries Agreement, there are some parties that don't have this experience. And that's, I think, part of the challenge, even within the fisheries agreement, of maintaining respect for Indigenous knowledge, protecting the use of data derived from Indigenous knowledge in the ways that Indigenous communities want it to be, is an ongoing debate, right? An ongoing challenge. There are some of the parties in the agreement don't have a history of dealing with these issues. And it's there's still a ways to go. At least that's my impression.
So is that something that, like, through the Joint Program for Scientific Research and Monitoring, are these questions being discussed in terms of just those concerns around data sovereignty, or even making sure that people understand, have the same language around, like, understanding these concepts? And because I'm just curious, you need like a solid baseline in order to even have that, discussion. But does it seem like that the foundation is there, or is there still work that needs to be done?
I think Vernay may have the best firsthand experience. I have not been in those meetings, but the reports that have come back to me is that yes, these debates have arisen, both in the context of the development of the Joint Program of Scientific Research and Monitoring, also in the data sharing protocol context. And my impression is that there's still some work to be done.
Yeah, there definitely is still some work to be done. And one thing I think that needs to be noted too is that there's nobody else that's going to put that forward besides ourselves. And so within this process, like, everything we're seeing unfolding are things that we've advocated for to be included. So when we show up every day, every time, to every single meeting, virtual or in person, we're bringing and following up on each of those pieces that we've advocated for. So we helped write the data sharing agreement, or to make sure that Indigenous knowledge has special parameters around it that are different than science. I saw somebody ask a question about, why don't you just call it Indigenous science? That probably has time for a long question later on, but really we're not trying to put Indigenous knowledge through this other framework of science and spit it out as something else. We're trying to bring these two knowledge systems together to be working together to come out with a stronger outcome and to be mutually beneficial to one another, but not being swallowed up into each other's into one framework. So it is a process that unfolds carefully and differently with each time you bring Indigenous knowledge together with science. It's not like a cookie cutter approach where one size fits all. But going back to us bringing everything to the table to contribute and to inform, there are a number of things within the Joint Program of Scientific Research and Monitoring that we are committed to developing. So recently, you might have seen, if you visit our website or our social media, you might see that we held Indigenous Knowledge Focus Group recently. ICC did, and outside of that, we started talking about some of these things and some of the outstanding commitments that we have and how are we going to achieve them. But it should also be understood that while there are commitments under the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and the Scientific Coordinating Group, we are looking at this from ICC from like the 10,000-foot level. So we're not only looking at Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, but we are looking at all the other bodies in which Indigenous knowledge is where we are actively contributing Indigenous knowledge to. So if there were going to be some sort of protocols on Indigenous or Inuit data sovereignty and how you access, utilize, share out, store, protect the knowledge, like those would be addressed in a collective approach. And that's another conversation. But we do have timelines set by this agreement that are rather fast-paced timelines. So we often find ourselves forced to work within those timelines, and we fully understand the pressure of those timelines and us serving on our national delegations. Of course, it took some footing to figure that out. How do we march forward together? Like Ambassador Bolton was saying, not everybody has an Indigenous counterpart to their delegation. So for those of us that do, of course, we had a little bit of a pathway that we had to figure out. How do we navigate this with all parts of our delegation working as one? And I think we have thankfully been able to navigate that process pretty well, where we have a good solid approach. There's a lot of trust within our delegation, and also the groundbreaking or landmark approach that this agreement has taken. It's really monumental for us that they have agreed to doing this ecosystem approach, that we're not just considering what is happening to the fish, but we're looking at what are the conditions, the dynamics of the sea ice. How are these other components of this ecosystem interacting and interdependent on one another? How is what's happening in the Pacific and Atlantic gateways connected to what is happening in those adjacent seas, and then connected to the Central Arctic Ocean? Sometimes I have in Herb too, in our advocacy, have been asked, so Inuit aren't in the Central Arctic Ocean. Why are you? Why should we ask you for what should be considered, and why does Indigenous knowledge matter when Inuit are not in the Central Arctic Ocean? But we are very connected to that ecosystem. And as Herb was saying earlier, that the resources that we depend on go into and out of that agreement area. And this ecosystem and the resources that are moving around within these ecosystems are not stopped by borders. They're going to be traveling inside and outside from the USA across through over there into the Russian waters, and you name it, all across that whole entire area.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, you brought up multiple really important points there. The timelines are definitely a challenge. And I think another really important point is distinguishing that when we're talking about combining Indigenous knowledge with, Western science, for lack of a better term, that it's not actually about, okay, we're just going to mush them together. It's about respecting them within their own right, but then looking at how they can be used to create a more full understanding of what we're trying to address from a policy level, which is ultimately about, the people and being able to sustainably engage with our environment. So we're actually at time, but I do just want to give the opportunity if there's any closing remarks that anybody wants to offer. I want to, provide that opportunity. So, maybe Dave, I'll go over to you if you have anything, and then I'll go to Vernay, Victoria, and Herb.
Thank you, Marissa. I mostly just want to say thank you to you, to Sana, to the others at the Dickey Center for organizing us and putting on the webinar. It was a great pleasure and privilege for me to be on this panel with my colleagues from ICC. Lovely to see them again, and look forward to the next time we get together. Thank you.
Vernay, did you want to add anything else?
Maybe we could turn it to Herb. I think he can do our closing remarks, I'm thankful that he's here with us. He's our leadership, and for ICC, although we are involved in this agreement through our national delegations, we do have office who takes the lead, and their office are the lead. So I'm okay with turning it to him in the
Okay, great.
of the time left.
Yep.
Oh, geez, I feel very special. You don't have to do that for Renee, but how about I do this? I just, I'm going to say a few words, then we'll pass it to Renee and Victoria for their comments. I as well too. I'm grateful. For Dave's leadership. I recall during the negotiation stage and up to the point where it was signed. It takes a lot of leadership, and patience to develop something like this, and Dave has certainly demonstrated that. As chair, and really moving this forward so that in a respectful way where there's respect within the knowledge systems preamble, and also inclusion of Indigenous peoples and the knowledge, which is us as Inuit. And I just want to say thanks to Renee, Ben, Victoria, Aviaya, and the team for really demonstrating that with new challenges in this world, there's something like this that could really demonstrate at this level to show that knowledge systems, when incorporated with science, in certain aspects, can really improve the quality of life. Especially with looking at the data sets that we want to start within the agreement area and adjacent to what we're doing in our national programs are a prime example of what should happen out there, and demonstrate how working with Indigenous peoples can ensure the conservation, and the coordination of such a space. So I'll hand it over to Renee and Victoria. Thank you so much, Marisol, Dave, and all the organizers as well too. It's a pleasure to sit here and learn from you today.
I also just wanted to thank you, Marisol, and your team there, as well as every other person who helped within this space, and to Ambassador Bolton for carrying that, him and to Herb too, for carrying that historical narrative of Ambassador Bolton being there behind the steering wheel for a good portion of this time for the United States, and the outlook at the time, which was inviting for Inuit to be a part of this process, in which we have seen a tremendous benefit to that process. And maybe the last thing I do want to add, and we may have touched upon it earlier, was that the only reason that this is as successful as it has been is because there was that flexibility at the time between Alaska, Canada, and Greenland to bring in Inuit leadership who contributed directly to those negotiations. And we often talk about this in research and anywhere else. If you want to have something successful, or if you want to establish a partnership with us or do something jointly, the best time to do that is from the very beginning, not considering us as an afterthought later. And often when that does happen, that's when you start to see maybe some upheaval or fighting the process or system, because we didn't get an opportunity to develop it to work for us. So we've been looking at this as it's not perfect. I will say that there are a lot of things that I'm sure Ambassador Bolton and anybody else, Herb, anyone else who was involved in the negotiations, didn't foresee, that we now, the ones who are implementing it, are sometimes faced with these things that may just have not been foreseen. And there are many lessons to be learned at the same time, but it does have the possibility to be looked at 50 years from now as a new standard or a new gold standard for how to go about these things. So, Guyana.
Great. And Victoria, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, sure. Just very briefly, thanks from me. Also acknowledging that, the world is changing very quickly, but some things are consistent, and I think Inuit are consistent. And we see a lot of treaties and conventions moving very quickly right now. The High Seas Treaty, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. All of these places are discussing these very important topics. So I look forward to also what we can accomplish together. Thanks for having us today.
Great, thank you. And I too am very appreciative of the years that I had with Dave at the Wilson Center and how willing he was to share his incredible knowledge. And I asked a bazillion questions, and he never once was like, "Stop asking me all these questions." And so it's really was very formative for my own professional development. So really appreciate that. And yeah, and I think this is obviously a conversation, but we'll keep moving forward. And I think there's so many different pieces of this that will feed into further conversations, and how we're thinking about policy. The era of disruption is not going anywhere, but I think we have there is a kind of a tension between the timelines, right, where we really need to be enacting like policies that really advance an acknowledgement of Earth systems, right, and this kind of interconnectivity. So hopefully through getting through to different communities and having these conversations, these conversations will continue to proliferate and try to get in front of some of the risk and create more benefits. So just want to say thank you so much to all of you for being part of this. And I know bandwidth is a real thing for all of the Arctic Indigenous peoples, including ICC. So really appreciate you all taking this time to be with us to share your knowledge. And thank you, Dave. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Sana, for all of your work on the back end. Really appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye bye.